Task-based language teaching is one of the most misunderstood ideas in TESOL. You can read the definition in a textbook, or you can even ask AI to explain it to you, and you'll probably get a perfectly good answer. But that doesn't mean you'll recognize a genuine or real task when you're planning a lesson. In fact, some of my strongest master's students have struggled with that exact thing. So today, I'd like to share a real example from my own teacher education practice that explains TBLT in a way that definitions often can't. I was recently mentoring a group of trainee teachers who were planning lessons for their teaching practice. One group had chosen the topic of earthquakes, and when I saw the lesson plan, I was a little bit unsure. Earthquakes can be a sensitive topic. We shouldn't necessarily avoid sensitive topics in language teaching, but we do need to approach them carefully. So I was interested to see how the student would handle that situation and that topic in their lesson. The lesson itself was well planned, and it followed the traditional presentation, practice, production, or PPP framework. And there wasn't anything wrong with the teaching. But afterwards, I led a group reflection with the trainee teacher and the peers who had observed the lesson. And one of the peers raised an important concern, and they said something like, "I'm not sure about this topic," or "I'm not sure if this topic is a good idea. There are earthquakes in the region I'm from, and I know people who have experienced them firsthand, and people have lost homes and a lot more." And when I listened to the students talking about it, or my trainees talking about it, I really agreed with that comment. And that comment really sat with me, but it also stayed with me for another reason. Earthquakes are a real part of people's lives, and that phrase, "a real part of people's lives," is the key to understanding why this topic might actually work really well through a task-based language teaching model. So this is where TBLT comes into its own. Imagine you're teaching children in an area where earthquakes are really a possibility, like maybe you live and work in that area right now. So instead of asking them to practice grammar or complete vocabulary exercises, you could give them a task. And that task could be create an emergency action plan for your classroom. And you could ask them questions like, what should students do if there's an earthquake? Where should they go? Who is responsible for what? What should happen if there's a power cut or communication systems stop working? Now, the lesson has, in this instance, a real purpose. Students are using English because they need to complete a meaningful task. And they have to discuss ideas, they have to negotiate, problem solve, make decisions, and produce something that could actually be displayed in their classroom. And more importantly, it could really be used if needed. And that's exactly what task-based language teaching is about. The task comes first, the language supports the task. If I took this into a situation where there's no earthquakes, it would just be an activity and none of it would be real. But in this case, the situation is real, so therefore the task is real as well. We do have a full explainer on TBLT, which you can find through the link above. But the key point here is that the task creates the need for language. So this might make you worry about your role as a language teacher. In my experience, the best thing to do during the task is observe how students communicate, identify the language they're using, and then help them to express their ideas more effectively. In other words, rather than teaching the language first and hoping students use it later, the task creates a real reason for the language to emerge. Of course, this doesn't mean that PPP is wrong. PPP works really well for many teaching situations, especially when learners need structured support with new language. But some topics naturally lend themselves to a task-based approach because they're rooted in real life. And that's also important when we're dealing with sensitive topics. Like I said, it's okay to teach sensitive topics, but we need to treat them with sensitivity and take them seriously, especially when they speak to real-world experiences. That's a key part to understanding TBLT. A question that has always really helped me is when I ask myself, am I teaching language about this topic, or can I create a task that gives learners a real reason to use the language? Often that small change in perspective can transform your planning. Thanks for watching, and if you've had a similar experience in your own teaching, let us know in the comments because we would love to know more about that. And if you'd like to learn more about task-based language teaching or about PPP, check out our videos here on TESOL with Micky and Ide. Hasta pronto!